In the name of the God of all truth. Amen. Please be seated. Earlier this week, I was thinking of this random recollection from my childhood. In the summer months, I would typically go spend some time with my grandparents on both sides. I would usually go apart from my brother. It was just my time with them. Consequently, it gave my parents time with each other. But from my perspective, at least, it was all about me. I had this special time that no one else had. I remember one morning when I was brushing my teeth, I determined that the toothpaste tube was empty. I was probably about 7 years old or so. I went to tell my grandmother that I needed more toothpaste, but she assured me that the tube was not, in fact, empty. She came into the bathroom and, sure enough, she squeezed out a bit more toothpaste. I vividly remember being in awe in that moment. The tube had clearly been empty. I would have sworn to it, even though my Southern Baptist grandmother would not have approved of me swearing. I had done everything I could to get more out, but I had still come up short. From where had she summoned this elusive toothpaste? I was so struck by this moment that I remember talking about it with my grandfather, Papa, later in the day. After I had recounted the story to him and shared my amazement with him, Papa responded matter-of-factly. He said, "You know, John Mark, that's why I'm married to grandmother, because she can get toothpaste out of an empty tube. I can't tell you how much I've saved on toothpaste all these years." And of course, I believed him. This was the same man who had convinced me for years that appendicitis was a dreaded disease that one could get from eating chocolate pie. Even though I've since learned better, I'll admit that I still don't really like chocolate pie, so deep was his influence. But that weird little anecdote from my youth has stayed with me through the years. Can't tell you how many times I've thought of that day when I was brushing my teeth as an adult. I thought of it this week because the tube appeared to be empty, and yet I squeezed out a few more days' worth of toothpaste. But the part that really stuck with me this week was the part about Papa declaring that that was why he had married my grandmother. At the time, I believed him with all of my heart. As a young child, not really understanding marriage, it made sense to me. If you're going to get married, you might as well marry someone who can help you save on toothpaste. At the time, it seemed as good a reason as any. Of course, now I know better. Part of what I know now is that my papa just had that particular dry brand of humor that permeates so many Richardsons at our little branch. The other thing I know is that he wasn't exactly lying either. The truth is, the story of the toothpaste is just one tiny example of my grandmother's creativity and ingenuity. Qualities that helped to sustain them through both good and challenging times in their more than 50 years of marriage. And while I would be willing to bet money, again, something grandmother would never approve of, I'd bet money that toothpaste wasn't remotely on Papa's mind when he determined to marry grandmother. I bet he was thinking of those deeper qualities. Those things that defined her character and her personality. It's just that one of the ways those qualities would get lived out in my own experience was through finding a little bit more toothpaste where there had seemed to be none. In the gospel lesson that we read today, we hear other proclamations from Jesus that on the surface seem almost counterintuitive. Almost as counterintuitive as marrying someone for the toothpaste savings they can offer. They don't make sense. They don't seem to add up to the full face value of what we come to expect from Jesus. He's saying that his purpose on this earth is to tear families apart. That his purpose on this earth is not to bring peace, but a sword. An instrument of death. It's hard to hear these words and to imagine that they belong to the Jesus of peace and justice and reconciliation that we encounter so much in the rest of the sacred story. But the deeper truth isn't always in the words as much as it is in the idea. And the bigger idea that Jesus is sharing with his disciples is that he will give them a new way to see the world. That the truth that they had taken as gospel before is now through the wisdom, through the new wisdom that comes from knowing Christ in the world. It just doesn't make sense anymore. The world has told you that value rests with the few, the wealthy and the leaders and the powerful. But in the new world order that Jesus promises, even tiny sparrows, which are indisputably of essentially no value, even they will have value to God. And though the powers and influencers of the world may tell us that we are of little or no value, aren't we at least worth more than tiny sparrows? And not only are we worth more than the sparrows, even the very hairs of our heads are valuable to God. So the deeper truth is that the ways that we had ordered the world before don't make sense when seen through the wisdom of God. That's the deeper truth that has sustained our relationship with God through these centuries. The church has made mistakes many, many times. We have too often fallen in line with the powers and the influencers of the world. And we fail to see value everywhere that God sees value. But the truth that sustains us, even in the midst of our failings through the years, is that the message of Jesus does shake us up. It does force us to see the world in different ways than our own imperfections and limitations would reveal. The secret to seeing beyond our own limitations and to begin seeing the value that God sees is pretty simple. The tradition of our faith tells us that as everything was created, God looked at it and saw that it was good. And the message of Jesus tells us that through Christ, the lens that God uses to see the world, everything is filtered by love. To step outside of our own failing proclivities and to try to see the world the way God would have us see it, that's all we need to remember. All of creation starts with goodness and is then filtered through love. It's simple to understand, but it takes a lifetime to practice. But working at seeing the world as good and beloved, that will shake up the world. Or at the very least, it will shake up our perception of the world. Things won't make sense from our current perspective, but they will align us with God's perspective. And that is the goal of the Christian message. We may not understand the details, but what we can do is work at aligning ourselves with God. That's the deeper truth that unfolds beneath these words that shake us up. Thanks be to God. Amen.